Good evening and welcome. My name is Fabio Gigi. I'm the chair of the Japan Research Center here at SOAS, and it's my honor to chair the session tonight. Our speaker tonight is Professor Hugh Whittaker, professor in the Economy and Business of Japan and director of the Nissan Institute of Japanese Studies in Oxford. His research encompasses Japanese and comparative corporate governance, innovation management, employment, entrepreneurship, and economic development. A recent co-authored book is Compressed Development, Time and Timing in Economic and Social Development, published by Oxford University Press and co-written with Timothy Sturgeon, Toshie Okita, and Tianbao Zhu. He's also the author of Comparative Entrepreneurship, the UK, Japan, and the Shadow of Silicon Valley, from 2009, and the editor of Corporate Governance and Managerial Reform in Japan, also 2009, and Recovering from Success, Innovation and Technology Management in Japan, 2006. And I hope you don't mind if I hold up the latest book that only just came out, which is called the same title as the lecture is tonight, Building a New Economy, Japan's Digital and Green Transformation. So we will follow a traditional academic format today with the lecture first, and then ample opportunity to ask questions later. Hello also to our friends joining online. You can start feeding especially burning questions into the Q&A function as the talk is going along. The talk tonight bears the title, as I already said, Building a New Economy, Japan's Digital and Green Transformation. So please join me in welcoming Professor Whittaker to the JRC.
Thank you, Fabio. When Fabio asked me to come and give a talk, I wasn't sure whether this book would be out or not. And it was out about a week ago, so there is actually a physical copy also, but I'm not here to sell the book. It's very expensive. You probably would want to access it via your library. Thank you for the invitation. Nice to be back at SOAS and in this lecture theatre where there are nice memories. I think the last time I was here, though, was possibly something about Ron Dorr, who was my PhD supervisor. So that was pre-COVID.
Yeah, 2019.
Yeah, so it's been a few years. I'm happy to be back. Thank you. So the topic of my talk today is the Japanese economy after 2015. And most of you who have anything to do with Japan will have encountered these terms: Society 5.0, DX, GX, new form of capitalism, etc., etc. So there are a lot of terms that have been introduced over the last decade, and my challenge has been to query whether these proliferation of programs and policies and slogans, whether it's confusion, profusion, desperation, or whether they actually may be coming together to create something new, a new economic model. And by a new economic model, I mean something where the institutions, there's institutional complementarity and ideational complementarity. And if that is the case, one can expect it to be quite different from the post-war Japanese model, which was centered around manufacturing and complementary institutions. Those institutions were undermined or weakened in the 1990s and 2000s, and the economy has changed structurally. So if there is a new complementarity, I can expect it to be around a different set of institutions. So confusion or a new model in the making, that's the question that arises from all of these terms. A priori, one can expect a different view of the possibilities of the Japanese economy, legitimate views about what's possible. I've set out 4 scenarios at the beginning of the book, and one of them is renewal. That's the one I'm particularly interested in. So is there a possibility of new institutional and ideational coherence emerging with this combination, Society 5.0, new capitalism, and not just at the macro level, but at the micro level as well? So is there a possibility for a new virtuous cycle of growth and distribution, which is Prime Minister Kishida's favorite catchphrase? Someone who's a little bit more skeptical might say, well, Japan is now a mature economy. It might have had complementary institutions in the post-war period, but that was because of particular circumstances, the destruction of World War II, the opportunity to build new institutions, the opportunity for rapid growth when lots of countries were growing rapidly. But now the Japanese economy is mature. It would be more difficult to get finance serving industry as it did in the post-war period. So there will be divergent interests, and it would be more difficult to create a kind of a system in the current circumstances than it was in the post-war period. So that's a maturity scenario. Overlapping with that is the idea that Japan has undergone a kind of conversion to neoliberalism and financialization from the 1990s and 2000s. And no matter what Mr. Kishida says about a new form of capitalism, and Keidan then says about sustainable capitalism, once the neoliberal cat is out of the bag, it's difficult to put it back in. Those 2 scenarios overlap, and then there's an even more pessimistic scenario that Japan has peaked, it's on its way down, its demography is working against it, the population is shrinking, deflation is likely to kick in again, and that's the kind of scenario that Brad Glossaman set out in his book, Peak Japan, 2 or 3 years ago. So my interest is particularly in the first scenario, that's an optimistic scenario, but tempered by these other 3 possible scenarios. So the overview of my talk today, I'm going to say a few words about Society 5.0 and new capitalism. Then I'm going to explain briefly the conceptual framework of this book and why it matters. And I'm not going to go very deeply into the empirical part of the book, but I'm going to say a few things about the macro level and the meso, city and industry level and corporate level empirical things that I've looked at. That will lead me to a discussion of contradictions that exist between the reform efforts at different levels. And I offer an interpretation of those contradictions, trying to bring back my optimism again. Most of you will be familiar with with the term Society 5.0. It was coined from the Council for Science, Technology and Innovation in 2015, when they wrote the 5th Science, Technology and Innovation Basic Plan. It has various definitions. This is the shortest one I could find, which fitted on a PowerPoint slide. There's a middle definition in terms of length. That is a human-centered society that achieves both economic development and solutions to social issues through a system that highly integrates cyberspace and physical space. The cyber-physical space is a characteristic of Society 5.0. It claims to be human-centered. So when this was first announced, cynics said, oh, this is meaningless. Germany came out with Industry 4.0, Japan wanted to go one better. So it had 5.0, and it wanted to say, this is not just about manufacturing, this is something more encompassing. So Society 5.0. And you can find a lot of people with that view in Japan. However, why I first became interested in this was listening to a lecture by Hadayama Yuko, who was on that council, and she explained that the intent, because it came out of science, technology, and innovation and policy for that, she said the triple disaster of 2011 forced the that council to reconsider the goals and means of science and technology policy and the need to prepare for a future which is not always predictable. So she said, instead of thinking about technology policy for competitiveness and developing technologies in a Schumpeterian way for competitiveness, we should actually think about technology and innovation policy to solve social needs. And of course, aging is one, but in the wake of the triple disaster, there was regional redevelopment and so on. So at least in intention of the council, there was to be a shift from technology-driven innovation policy to social needs-centered innovation policy. There's also, you can detect from some of the statements about Society 5.0 that the council, at least implicitly, wanted science, technology, and innovation policy and practice in Japan to steer a different path from oligopolistic big tech on the one hand and an overbearing state on the other. So Society 5.0 was to aim for a middle ground and balance the role of the state and the role of the private sector in a way that was different from the US on the one hand and China on the other. So it's not often stated publicly, but talking to people who are close to the council, it seems to be underpinning some of the thinking about Society 5.0. And in fact, it wasn't just a slogan because it found its way into the 6th basic plan for science, technology, and innovation, into Keidanren, into a lot of ministry documents, into the cabinet office, and you find it in companies as well. So Society 5.0, at least in business circles, is still debated 9 years after it was introduced. On the other hand, the Society 5.0 is more about innovation and science, technology, and innovation policy. But later in the 2010s, and especially around 2020, you started hearing in Japan, first of all, Keidanren talking about its new growth strategy, and linked to that was statements about sustainable capitalism. Now, the context for this was growing criticism of shareholder-oriented capitalism. And in 2018, the US Business Roundtable, which is kind of a bastion of US capitalism, expressed a need to change from shareholder-oriented capitalism to one which was a more stakeholder-oriented form. In the UK, the British Academy had a campaign, and the Financial Times had a campaign, the World Economic Forum, et cetera, started talking about the need to shift to a stakeholder model of capitalism. So in part, Keidanren, which is the Japan Business Federation, the biggest peak business federation in Japan, in part, they were joining in this chorus, but there had also been concerns within Japan about social divisions and the hollowing out of the middle class and so on, and the need to do something about that. So Keidanren put together a statement and a vision called Sustainable Capitalism. And just after that, when he was running to become the president of the LDP, Kishida came out with his new form of capitalism, or Atarashi Shihon Shugi. So this vision of Kishida's provoked some panic on the stock market in Japan, because he was talking about a virtuous cycle of growth and distribution, and shareholders panicked about the word distribution because they thought they might have to pay some of that money for distribution, and it might work against them. So the stock market slumped 7% within a few days of that announcement. I think Prime Minister Kishida's vision was informed by a previous prime minister of his faction, that's Ikeda Hayato in the 1960s, who had an income doubling vision, and Kishida's new form of capitalism also had an income doubling vision, and he quickly backtracked to investment income doubling, which is very different from income doubling. But I think Kishida's instincts were to hark back to the post-war model, where there was income doubling, but there was also an agreement with Sokyo and the trade unions about the spring labor offensive. So the mechanism was productivity growth and distributing the fruits of the productivity growth through the spring offensive, and that would achieve a broad-based growth in incomes and a virtuous cycle of consumption and production. So I think that Mr. Kishida was influenced by that, but he had to backtrack quite quickly. Anyway, new form of capitalism is less about innovation, and it's more about distributional issues and regulatory issues in the economy. So in the book, I progress from the Society 5.0 progressively towards capitalism and these distributional issues, and also from macro towards micro, and then back to macro level again. A few words about the framework. When people talk about digital transformation or green transformation in Japan, they often say that Japan is a laggard. Digital transformation, it's a laggard vis-a-vis the US. Green transformation, it's a laggard vis-a-vis Europe. And there's often this kind of dichotomous comparison. So in this book, I wanted to avoid dichotomous comparisons and present a broader framework which Japan and other countries could be represented. So I borrowed this framework from the book Compressed Development, and this picture that you have in front of you, this figure, has two sets of dyads, and the top one is states and markets, and the bottom one is organization and technology. And the argument is that states and markets historically have tended to evolve together. So the emergence of modern markets and modern capitalism in the 19th century also was accompanied by some rather significant changes in the state and the role of the state for the functioning of the market, and they evolved together. Similarly, waves of technological innovation tend to bring new forms of organization, and they evolve together. But there's a feature in these dyads in that you see for the state and market, there's a regulating phase and a liberalizing phase, and that draws on the concept of Karl Polanyi from his book, The Great Transformation, which is a study of liberalism and the growth of fictitious markets of land and labor and finance in the 19th century. And he traces that from that through to reactions against that and the growth of new roles by the state, for example, in Bismarck's Germany and welfare measures, to more extreme reactions of the 1920s and 1930s. And in particular, what he's interested in is where did Nazism come from? And his implicit argument is that it came from liberalism in the 19th century. So there's where you have what he calls a disembedding of markets, then it will eventually provoke a reaction against that in what is called a double movement. So that was, the book was written in 1944 or 43, but there have been more recent attempts to map that onto not the UK-centered liberalism and the reactions against it, but to US organized neoliberalism and recent reactions against that. So there's a double movement in this, and that double movement also appears in this organization and technology dyad. So new technologies are introduced and they cause disruption, and very often, along with disruption, investors pile in and bubbles form and bubbles collapse, and then the state has to come in and start regulating markets. So a neo-Schumpeterian view of stages of installation of new technologies and organizational forms, two writers, Budryzic and Adler, in the Administrative Science Quarterly, came out with this two-stage model, which is kind of analogous to Polanyi's view of states and markets. So those are those two dyads. And at the top of this picture, you see that there's a geopolitical and economic context. So liberalism of the 19th century, the dominant power was Britain. It became the US. And so my Monday Ishki, the problematic that I see is that states and markets have kind of come to a point of inflection where there is conflict around the neoliberal model and a kind of contestation to see how the state-market relationship will evolve. The same applies to organizations and technology, the disruption caused by digital technologies in the form of fake news, but also monopoly and tax evasion and so on and so on. So new moves to regulate regulate technologies, and we can see it happening with artificial intelligence too. And geopolitically, we're at a stage of inflection between the struggle between the US and the rising power of China. So there is, in this framework, an understanding that we're in a period of significant change on all of those three levels. Also, that Japan may not be a pioneer in terms of new technologies, but its rise in the post-war period was in the balancing phase of the wave of automobiles and the petrochemical industries. So in fact, Japan might do better in balancing phases. So although it may appear that Japan is a laggard in terms of digital and green, in terms of evolutionary perspective, that might not be a bad thing. And in fact, Japan, hypothetically at least, may rise again in this new phase. So this framework avoids the tendency to pit Japan against one other picked country and create polar opposites. So Japan can be identified here, so can the US, so can Germany, and the UK, and so on. So that's the conceptual framework, and the cladding on this, what my interest is how this is manifested institutionally and ideationally. You're probably familiar with varieties of capitalism, the liberal market and the coordinated market dichotomies. They tend to emphasize stable configurations of organizations. There are other schools which emphasize a more chaotic process of institutional change, and the régulation school of Robert Boyer and others in Paris. For them, institutions are always in a state of flux and evolution, and occasionally you will get a viable institutional configuration like you had after World War II in what they call Fordism, and that had macro and micro institutional complementarities. So from that perspective, Japan's post-war model was a variation of the Fordist model. Might have been distinctive, but not necessarily unique. My view is closer to those, to the régulation school. So the post-war, the régulation school people were interested in why this Fordist model broke down, and the institutions which were central to that model, what they called the wage-labor nexus, became subordinated to a monetary financial set of institutions, and labor and employment was marginalized. So the same thing happened to some extent in Japan in the 1990s and 2000s, not to the extent of the UK and the US, but Japan kind of moved away from its post-war model as a result of both external pressure and a desire from within Japan to change its model. But it ended up with institutional incoherence. And my question then is, from 2015, do we see the seeds of a new coherence that will emerge? So there are three levels of analysis. It's not just institutions on a national level. It's, do the institutions on different levels fit together? The challenge in this book is how to work on multiple levels without it becoming just a jumble. So I'm not sure if I've succeeded, but I will. I'll give you a taste of how I've tried to deal with that. First of all, at the national level, since 2015, and particularly since 2019 or so, there's been a revival of industrial policy and innovation policy. This hasn't just happened in Japan, it's happened in lots of countries, particularly after the global financial crisis. But in the latest late 2010s, associated with digital transformation and green transformation, you can see in the UK debates about how to promote green transformation and whether industrial policy should be used or not. The Conservative Party is tying itself up in knots about this. So I'm interested in green and digital. Green transformation, the Cabinet Office and METI and other ministries came out with a green growth strategy. From memory, it was about 2020, situating decarbonization and green policy in Japan as industrial policy. In other words, not posing decarbonization and economic growth or development as contrary forces, but claiming that they can develop together. And the green growth strategy had 8 sets of industries and a range of policies to promote the green transformation of Japan. And that was followed, in fact, just last year by the GX Realization Basic Plan, GX Green Transformation. And it is it's a detailed roadmap of changes in the next 10 years in a range of industries, which will get Japan to the goal that Suga made, promised Joe Biden, that Japan would reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 46% relative to 2013 by 2030. So this GX Realization Basic Plan is a plan to do that, and it envisages 20 trillion yen of public funding to be raised through GX economic transition bonds, which the first lot were just offered this week. And that 20 trillion yen of publicly raised funding is supposed to leverage 150 trillion yen of private sector funding for GX. That is a scale that's 10 times more than was originally envisaged in the green growth strategy. So there's a set of green transformation policies. This figure I've got here relates more to digital transformation. And I just, I put this up here because I couldn't find a better picture. But if you had looked at the Cabinet Office 10 or 15 years ago, it would have looked completely different from this. So Chalmers Johnson, in his book METI and the Japanese Miracle, kind of ascribed Japan's post-war economic development to METI, or now METI. But in fact, the Cabinet Office has become much more central in the deployment of industrial policy. And within the work of the Cabinet Office, science, technology, and innovation policy has become more important. Economic security has become more important. Defense has become more important. And cybersecurity has become more important. Of course, that's because the evolution of the digital economy raises those new risks, and Japan is as prone to those as anyone else. Well, perhaps not to the extent of the US. So this this picture, there's a digital agency in there which didn't exist until a couple of years ago. The National Security Council didn't exist till 10 years ago. So a lot of new institutions are being built in the state, and that influences the way that the state interacts with markets. For instance, the Economic Security Act that was introduced with a view to stopping technology leakage from going to less friendly states. Just this week, I think it was, Japan introduced a security clearance system based on the US model. So it's not just people working in the public sector, but private sector working with sensitive technologies now have to get clearance, and there are 2 levels of clearance. So the interaction between the state and the economy also is evolving, and depending on how the geopolitical situation in East Asia evolves, it could evolve in a more defense-oriented way. It could evolve in a more peaceful way. That is still up in the air. But one thing we can say for sure is that this period from the 1990s into the 2010s, which kind of was rolling back on industrial policy and the role of the state, particularly under Koizumi in the first half of the 2000s, that is past, and the state is, it's not the same kind of industrial policy as the post-war period, but it's still a kind of a new developmental state, I'll call it that. There are 2 aspects of meso-level analysis in here. One is cities and one is industries. So you're probably familiar with the terms eco-cities and smart cities. There's a worldwide boom. Developing countries, developed countries. Perhaps the UK is about the only country you don't hear about smart cities. But if you go to China or India or any African country, smart cities are sometimes seen in developing countries as a way of jumping directly into the digital age without going through full-blown manufacturing, which has become increasingly difficult. So there is, and Japanese companies are involved in smart city development in India and Indonesia and so on. But the origin of smart cities in Japan, depending on how you trace them, you can trace them back to the Technopolis projects in the 1980s, when Japan was riding high, and there were these kind of grand images for digital super advanced cities in pastoral context. And that faded in the 1990s for a variety of reasons. And Japan's contemporary smart cities actually have more humble backgrounds. From the 2000s, from Koizumi's deregulation and decentralization drive and energy projects. So smart didn't necessarily mean digital at the beginning. It meant smart people, smart working, and sometimes smart grids. And there were a lot of little projects. METI ran projects that were called smart communities. So in the 2000s, it was relatively low key, but as smart cities became more prevalent and attention centered on them in other countries in the late 2000s, the Japanese government, the Cabinet Office, METI, and other ministries became interested and started to systematize their support for smart cities or future cities or eco-cities, compact cities. They had a range of programs. They've been increasingly coordinated, and private-public partnerships around smart cities and research institutes, etc., have been set up. The idea of smart cities is that there are different visions of smart cities, but there's always a kind of a platform in which data is aggregated and different services are based on that data and customer, and they relate to customers. So this is e-government, e-education, digital medicine, and so on. Europe is a leader in smart cities, and a European consortium developed software called Furware, and that was used in some of Japan's smart cities. Barcelona had its own participation-oriented smart city platform, which they called Decidum. That was also used. Japan is also developing software for these platforms. So but there is a range of things that are called smart cities in Japan. And in the book, I look at 4 types of smart cities. One is Higashi Matsushima, which was a smallish city outside of Sendai, which was destroyed in 311. So some of the recovery of some of these communities on the Tohoku coastline there have become future cities or smart cities. So that's one. Another one is Kashiwanoha, which is on the express line to Tsukuba, just before Tsukuba. And it's developed by Mitsui Bussan. So it's a kind of a land development type of smart city. Third one is Aizu Wakamatsu, which is the core players there are Aizu Wakamatsu City, Accenture, and Aizu University, which has a focus on computing, and they've created a core and a platform, and that's quite famous for participation, for soliciting citizen participation in the design of the smart city. And the fourth one is Toyota's Woven City, which is at the base of Mount Fuji, and that's being developed de novo, interestingly, without cars above ground. All the cars and vehicles go underground. But it's a kind of an experimental site for Toyota to develop technologies beyond automotive. So Toyota is trying to reinvent itself as a mobility company, and not just mobility, but also interacting with smart cities. So this is its kind of experiment. Industry level, obviously, information technology and automobiles are central to the future of Japan, both digital and green. And the last 20 years or so have seen the electronics IT sector relatively decline, and automobiles kind of stepping in to uphold the Japanese economy. So digital transformation in IT electronics and also in automobiles are important parts of the book. With the worsening of the geopolitical situation and global value chains being reshaped through reshoring and friendshoring, there's an opportunity for Japan to reclaim some of its former capabilities in semiconductors in particular. this time not necessarily through Japanese companies, but by attracting notably TSMC, which has, I think its first production site in Kyushu is going to start very soon, and they're making a second factory. Micron Technology from the US in Hiroshima. Samsung has set up an R&D facility in Yokohama, and in Hokkaido, a Japanese consortium called Rapidus has been formed to create cutting-edge semiconductors. So there's a lot of companies being attracted by Japanese subsidies, but also a restructuring of global value chains, and partly in the context of US-Japan relations and collaboration in not just semiconductors, but other 5G and beyond 5G technologies. So there's an opportunity to rebuild the electronics industry. Automobiles is going through a revolution on multiple fronts, sometimes called CASE, which stands for Connected, Electric, it's shared or subscription, so CA, autonomous, shared or subscription, and electric. So, of course, Tesla and some Chinese newly established companies have taken the lead, and Toyota is trying to reclaim or trying to catch up in electric vehicles. So without going into more detail of those, I think as far as those giants like Hitachi and Toyota go, I think what I see happening is that they are doing DX with Japanese characteristics. And by that, I mean, they are not embracing information technology and platforms at the expense of manufacturing, but they're trying to combine the two. In the case of Hitachi, they have repositioned themselves through a series of mergers and acquisitions and divestitures. And one of the consequential acquisitions was of Global Logic, a US IT company with 10,000 employees. And at a stroke, Hitachi was able to internationalize its platform, which is called Lumada, with these engineers who were not just based in the US, but other countries as well. Toyota, likewise, is not abandoning the production of automobiles, but it has added a new business group called Woven Planet Holdings, which has 3 operating companies, and Woven City comes under that. So the IT part of the company really is strongly represented in this Woven Planet, and a lot of the key people there are non-Japanese, and including the CEO, whose name is James Kufner, and he was, I think he was Google or an autonomous driving, the chief of Google or one of those GAFA companies in the US, and Toyota headhunted him. So Toyota also, in a different way, is trying to combine its manufacturing prowess with digital transformation through these 2 branches. I think I'm running a little bit late, so I will skip fintech and startups, and we can come back to those later if we have time. Okay, so at the company level, innovation and DX and GX is one focus. Then shifting to the new capitalism, I'm looking at the prospects for new capitalism through corporate governance. And corporate governance was one of Abe's targets for transformation. He wanted to make Japan more attractive to international investors. So in 2014, he introduced the Stewardship Code and 2015 Corporate Governance Code. They were modeled somewhat after British codes. And the argument, there was a kind of a dual argument there, and one of them was that Japan needs to improve its return on investment or return on equity for its shareholders to make Japan attractive for overseas investors. And the kind of mantra was that Japanese companies' ROE was 4% on average, and the global standard was 10 or 12%. So to be respectable, Japan needed to raise its profitability to 8% at least. So there was that, but there was also a kind of a wording in those codes about the need for managers and investors to work together to improve corporate value over the long term. So it wasn't a shareholder maximization call, it was improving the lot of shareholders, but not necessarily maximizing it, working together for the long term. May have been optimistic thinking, but that was embedded in those codes, which were comply or explain soft law. So if you didn't comply with the demands of these codes, you should explain. But over the years, they've become increasingly prescriptive. So if you want to be listed on the prime section of the Tokyo Stock Exchange now, you need to do an increasing list of things, including the number of external directors and how you report on different things. So, and it's not just a matter of returns. There have been other elements added into corporate governance, like from METI, a digital governance code, on the view that the Japanese senior managers were not sufficiently conversant with digital transformation and they needed to get a better grip on it. So there was a code that was introduced about what senior managers should be aware of and how they should collect information and distribute information in their companies. And ESG as well, that's environment, social, and governance. That came in at about 2015. And it came in very quickly and strongly through the Government Pension Investment Fund. GPIF was at the time the largest shareholder of Japanese shares. And the ratio of shares held by GPIF in its overall portfolio of domestic shares was raised to 25%. And so it mattered to the Japanese government the returns that GPIF got from these investments in shares. It was a long-term holder of shares, so it wasn't there for short-term profits. But at the same time that the portfolio of GPIF changed, it also signed up to the principles of responsible investment of the UN, and that's where ESG came into Japan and through GPIF. And the GPIF created its own stewardship principles and required companies that its managers or agents invested in to report, for instance, on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and other ESG indices. So the corporate governance has become an increasingly packed agenda for senior managers and jostling in their ideas of returns for investors, digital governance, ESG, and so on. And the return on investment now has been replaced by price book ratio, and the Tokyo Stock Exchange is demanding of companies, if they don't have their valuation greater than their book value, then they should explain and take measures to improve. So corporate governance has become the key institutional nexus or axis in Japan in the way that employment relations were in the post-war period. So employment relations institutionally have been downgraded, and corporate governance has taken its place, but it's also contested. So I want to show you a few statistics. This was Prime Minister Kishida's new form of capitalism council, when it first met, had these statistics put in front of them. Large companies valued at 1 billion yen or more in 2000, in the year 2000, spent 21.8 trillion on capital investment. In 2020, they spent 20.7 trillion. So capital investment was flat. Labor costs were flat. Meantime, operating profits doubled. Internal reserves almost tripled, and returns to investors just through dividends, not share buybacks, they rose sixfold. So that tells a certain story. It's somewhat misleading because the capital investment doesn't include investment overseas. It only includes investment within Japan. So companies were busy investing overseas, and nowadays, the returns from overseas investment constitute about 10% of Japan's GNP. So an increasingly large portion of the Japanese economy is coming from overseas investment. But that doesn't necessarily help the domestic economy. It helps the economies that Japan is investing in, raises their GDP, and it raises their employment levels and so on. But it just gets fed back into Japan and goes into internal reserves or dividends, as you see. So this is presenting a conundrum for Prime Minister Kishida. This is part of the thinking, well, perhaps we need to rebalance this, and we need, if we want to create a new dynamic cycle of growth and distribution, we better try and raise the distribution to labor, and that will raise consumption, but it will also start to work into productivity. So the conventional thinking about raising productivity and then labor sharing some of those returns was kind of reversed in the last year or two. And that's why the government has been pushing so strongly for the spring, what used to be Shunto, spring wage round, to trying to push employers and giving incentive to employers to give over inflation, above inflation wage increases, which from a UK perspective is kind of heretical. In the UK, you only hear about the Bank of England warning against wage rises pushing inflation. But in Japan, you hear the government, and you hear it again now because the spring round is in full motion. And even Keidanren, the business federation, calling on its members to, wherever possible, give wage increases above inflation. Okay, so there seem to be contradictory or conflicting currents of change in Japan. And one interpretation is through corporate governance and returns to shareholders, is a kind of a continuation on the line, along the line of financialization and increasing importance of the financial sector at the expense of other parts of the economy. And then on the other hand, you have the government and even Keidanren pushing for something which is beyond neoliberalism, rebuilding the middle class and so on. So there are definitely tensions and contradictions. My last chapter in the book is, do we end it there? Is it simply enough to say, okay, there are contradictions and therefore this is, all of these initiatives actually don't amount to much? There's another possible interpretation, and this is the optimist in me coming out. I've borrowed the term spirits of capitalism from two French writers, Boltanski and Chipello, who wrote a book called The New Spirit of Capitalism. I've very liberally changed some of their ideas, and I see in Japan three spirits of, or three sets of institutional change, or three trajectories of institutional change. One of them is a continuation of financialized capitalism that you see promulgated by the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the Financial Services Agency, and so on. So, and Prime Minister Kishida, when he was speaking at the New York Stock Exchange, said, no, we're going to continue with these corporate governance reforms and so on and so on. So that spirit is one spirit that you can see. A second spirit is, I hesitate to call it state capitalism because people strongly associate that with China, but it is a kind of a state capitalism, or as I've called it here, a new developmental state, a new manifestation of Japan's developmental state, in which the state plays a greater role in shaping the economy. And the third one is communitarian capitalism. Japanese capitalism was originally, at least in the post-war model, stakeholder-oriented. But not only were individual companies and the way they treated shareholders and employees stakeholder-oriented, but you see in Japan a lot of cooperatives. They played quite a big role in the post-war reconstruction. And a lot of the world's biggest cooperatives are to be found in Japan. And I'm not just talking about Nokyo, the agricultural cooperatives, which are very famous, but the labor movement and cooperative movement interacted in the post-war period to make things like Rokin, labor banks, which were organized cooperatively, a whole range of institutions. And that is a kind of, some Nakanichi talked about Japan as a vertical society. Japan has a strong horizontal tradition as well, and cooperatives going back into the Edo period and the Hotokai and these other kind of horizontal self-help movements persisted into the present. So there are various movements in Japan which are more horizontal, including NPOs and different visions of capitalism, and as well as individual companies which are stakeholder-oriented. So I borrowed this term communitarian capitalism from Marie Anchortegui in one of her books, but people use the term coordinated capitalism and so on. So I see these three here evident in Japan, and the optimist in me says, if you are confronted with a difficulty in changing institutions. In other words, institutional state stasis, which has been, institutions are difficult to change in Japan. But if you're confronted by that, perhaps, this is an optimistic reading, perhaps the government welcomes a certain amount of financialized capitalism as the foreign agent, the seed which can bring about change. And the state is having to play a greater role in coordinating the economy because it's living in a much less friendly world, and the digital economy brings new risks and so on. But to counterbalance financialized capitalism, Japan has this legacy of communitarian type capitalism. So perhaps these three are, to some extent, coordinated in what I would call coordinated disequilibrium. In other words, trying to bring change through the interaction of these three, but not too much change, which might cause social disruption. So the final chapter in my book is called Coordinated Disequilibrium. Rather than just saying these are three different spirits and their contradictions, perhaps eventually they will work together to create Society 5.0, which its architects want to establish by 2030, or at least the 2030s. So this is the contents of the book. As I said, it's just come out and very expensive. I shouldn't say that. I didn't say that. I hope no one's recording me online. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic tour de force. I'm just going to unshare the screen so people can see us again. So, well, I wanted to ask you, as I'll kick us off and then I'll open up to the floor.
Over here,
If you could, yes, if it's more comfortable, you
I
can.
might need this book to remind me. You write something and then you move on and you forget.
So
maybe it's my age.
I wanted to start off with a question about, because you talked a little bit of Society 5.0, it's very much, if you look at it on YouTube, there's all these little clips that sort of imagine a robot-led society, direct drone deliveries to home. There's sort of a kind of a science fiction aspect to it. I think that speaks to the imagination of the people. And then you have the Moonshot program, which is, if you look at the goals, it's a massive investment program into science, has amongst its goals permanent habitation on the moon and the development of telepathy through brain interfaces. I mean, it sounds like this is something completely different, right? So I was wondering, how do you put these things together? Is this sort of a deliberate strategy to sort of create the excitement and sort of, yes, to tease the imagination, because it is fantastic to think about these things, right? It's a very much science fiction idea of what the future holds, which together with your prediction seems, I mean, yes, it seems to be strategic in some ways. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Okay. Society 5.0, the first part of your question was, can you just remind me? I got taken away by Moonshot and
right.
And so on.
Well, it's a similar question. It's what is the role of the imagination to sort of to have this futuristic idea?
Okay. Well, I think a lot of the DX things were tried in the early 2000s, and they didn't work. Perhaps it was too early. And there was this kind of lament in Japan about Japan having lost its plot in IT and digital transformation. And I think the role of Society 5.0 was to get people away from looking at the past and looking towards the future. So that's why I think they could get buy-in from lots of different people. It was a way of thinking, okay, how do we create this future? And they commissioned, I think it was Keidan, commissioned a guy called Nomura to do research on what he called Society 5.0 technologies, and there were a whole list of technologies, and compare the scenario of what the Japanese economy would be in 2030 if Japan invested in these technologies versus what it would be if it didn't invest in these technologies. And he produced these great big contrasts. And so it was a way of getting people to buy into a debate about the future and thinking about future-oriented technologies. On the other hand, there is this this aspect from the original Society 5.0, which was to say, let's focus on social needs. And I think that innovation policy in Japan is kind of stuck between three dilemmas. So I talked about contradictions or spirits of capitalism. I think there are kind of dilemmas in innovation as well. And one of the dilemmas is, are existing large companies going to be the vehicles of transformation in Japan, or is it going to be startups? And the government is putting a lot of effort into promoting startups. And people who create businesses feted by, the Prime Minister gives awards and things. So they're kind of national heroes. It reminds me of the 1960s, where there were the skill Olympics, Gino Godin, and they were the craftsmen, the young craftsmen who participated were feted by the government and so on. Now it's the entrepreneurs who are feted, not necessarily for their individualistic money-making capabilities, but for their contribution towards the transformation of Japan. So I think there's a kind of a dilemma in the government about the vehicle for transformation. And in typical Japanese form, the answer is both. And let's get large companies investing in startups to promote startups, and let's get them working synergistically. A second dilemma is this one about social needs versus technology-driven innovation. And I think Japan, although the Society 5.0 is premised on this social needs, it kind of takes the form of robots in care homes, whether they're needed or not. And I think, what's his name, Wright?
Right, yes.
Wrote this book about the robots that were kept in cupboards in care homes. So there's this kind of dilemma about whether we really should go all out and change innovation policy, or whether we will try to do both. And a lot of these Society 5.0 and mobility as a system videos, they show driverless cars taking old people in rural areas to hospitals because there are no buses anymore and no taxis and so on. So that's kind of the archetypical advertisement for some of these technologies. Nowadays, they're about going to the moon and so on. That's come quite suddenly. I think there's a third dilemma, and that is Japan catching up, or is Japan post-catching up? And in the digital world, I think Japan has slipped back. If you look at digital transformation kind of rhetoric, it's all about how do we avoid digital defeat? and Japanese companies are not investing enough in digital, and the digital agency isn't doing this and that. So there's a kind of a catch-up mentality in digital. On the other hand, Japan wants to, and I think it has a greater prospect of doing it in green transformation. And I think there's some really original system type thinking about how Japan is going to go down the road of green transformation. And to some extent, it's got its eye on Europe and European policy, but to some extent, I think this is less seen as a threat and more seen as an opportunity. And so I see that dilemma also in policies. As for the moon, that's really interesting. Who would have thought 10 years ago that the ecosystem for companies doing things related to the moon would not be the typical suspects of the heavy industry companies and so on, but there'd be all these startups and then all these other companies which use satellite information investing, and there's a kind of a really rapidly forming and changing ecosystem. And it's because of the defense implications of space, it's kind of dual use, commercial and defense, and it's being orchestrated in collaboration with the US. So some of these startups in Japan, their client is not JAXA, the Japanese space agency, it's NASA. So it's, and I think NASA is looking to work with a wider range of partners in countries that are friendly towards the US. So there's a kind of a mutual thing going on there. So it's not just industrial policy, it's kind of international collaboration as well. And this scramble for the moon, yeah, Japan wants to be in there partly for commercial reasons, but partly because there are serious security implications as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, in much depth. Thank you. Let's open it up to the floor. Yes, over here and then over there.
Yeah, recently Japan was successful to like start PayPay or like Shibuya Scramble Scare, you know, that many of IT groups are coming back. But don't you think there is a hindrance of this perfectionism of bureaucracy also? For example, when you see Japanese manuals, it's like very wordy, everything they want to explain. Actually, the digitalization is more simplifying things, like when you see the digital phones and icons and you hide all of the buttons, but when you see Japanese products, they have so many buttons, so many functions. So
you need a PhD to operate it.
They want to make it perfect. Or second thing, maybe technically, like many of Japanese companies, they don't internalize of like IT platform, they outsource. So it worked in the past, but don't you think it is too much costly, takes too much of time? And then I want to know how in digitalization process Japan is dealing with these problems.
Okay, I think you've got two questions there. One is perfectionism, which leads to the so-called Galapagos syndrome. And definitely that was a factor in the decline of Japan's semiconductor industry, because the perfectionism that Japanese companies brought to mainframes in the 1980s, they didn't modify that when desktops and laptops, which didn't require such stringent quality, and they were undercut by Samsung and the Taiwanese foundry makers. So there definitely has been and still is a problem. People call it engineer egotism. The kind of idea, we were never beaten technologically. We were only beaten because our price was undercut. But hold on a minute. What is what is quality? As my friend Robert Cole, who was involved in the US quality movement, says, quality is fitness of use as defined by the customer, not by the producer. So if it doesn't fit the customer's requirements, then you cannot say the quality is good. Well, you can argue about the definition, but that definitely has been a problem. And I think the Japanese government is aware of that and aware that it worked against Japan in IT and the development of the internet and telecommunications, as well as semiconductors. And it was so deeply embedded in the quality culture of companies after the war that it's been very difficult to change it. But the government has introduced sandbox systems and things to encourage experimentation, but that culture is I would say is still there. And outsourcing is another challenge because banks and other big companies outsourced their IT development to specialist companies, and they didn't know what they and within Japanese companies, the status of the chief information officer was relatively low, and there were relatively few software engineers. It wasn't a particularly high status job within companies. Other types of engineering, hardware engineering, got more status. So that's part of the digital governance code. And it was highlighted in a report in 2018 called the Digital Cliff. Meti came out with this thing, and I'm not sure if the cliff was going downwards or going upwards, but it said that by 2025, the cost of maintaining legacy IT systems would outweigh the value that they were creating. And so, and part of the problem it identified was outsourcing and the lack of digital skills within companies, and particularly in the higher echelons of management. They didn't know what was going on. And so they had no capability to respond to DX. That was, so Meti came out with this digital governance code and DX stocks and DX indicators to kind of highlight and reward excellent companies that were kind of developing these skills in-house. So that was a kind of a push as a result of that digital cliff report of 2018. So I wouldn't say those problems have gone away. They're ongoing problems, and that's partly why DX is seen as a challenge and a threat rather than an opportunity.
Thank you. Another question from Takahashi Sensei.
Professor Takahashi from Chuo University, Tokyo. And then, first of all, thank you very much for the nice and insightful presentation and the good organized book. And it's I have a different opinion that this book must buy because it's so many it's diversified inside subject and well organized, concentrating the DX and GX. But anyway, I want to ask one thing concerning the green transformation. It's so for the, some guys understanding the Japanese sentiment seem like the pendulum is just overshooting equilibrium. That's from I think just like it's at that situation that Japan's approach to adjust the equilibrium or sentiment is just 2 or 3 types. One is the completely change, rejecting from the previous and then taking new one. And another is just a patchwork, just like the carbon price and now the gasoline prices
Mhm.
And the third one is just cry a sexual slogan and doing nothing. Like, but anyways, about the green transformation, the Japanese government's approach of the issuing the transition bond is quite unnatural for the especially continental Europe guys, because it's not directly issued by the company or the industry, and it's a kind of subsidiaries from the government and a part of the sovereign bonds. It's a lack of transparency, and it's also kind of the patchwork of doing the sovereign bonds, and it's corporate to green transparency bond together. How do you think it's compared to the UK or US or the continental Europe?
Well, compared to the UK, where the government also flip-flops, and GX is a kind of a political football. I think, and the US with its Inflation Reduction Act and the more conventional kind of financing for that, I think there's a lot of interest in whether these GX transition bonds will actually raise 20 trillion yen. And I think the first issue was 800 billion yen or something like that. Why not? Why not? I mean, it's kind of similar to a sovereign bond. And the government intends to repay the bonds through carbon taxes and carbon pricing measures later in the 2020s. So it's an innovative proposition. And I think nobody knows really whether it will work or not. But I would credit the Japanese government of trying something innovative. And what else can they do? They can't really add to conventional government debt easily. They can't, Keidanren is already twitchy about whether the defense spending will result in increasing corporation tax. So everyone's twitchy about tax. So this is a potential way out of that impasse. So this is my optimist, always optimist. I think it's a very interesting initiative, and I hope it succeeds, because if it succeeds, then it might help laggards and kind of backsliders like the UK to become more serious about financing green transformation.
Thank you. We have a question online, and then we'll come back to the room. So our very own Helen McNaughton asked, "Hi Hugh, great to hear your talk, and sorry not to make it in person to see you tonight. I want to share your hope for seeds of institutional change in society 5.0, but I struggle to see it happen based on recent and current inertia for some time now in key areas such as 1, lagging gender equality at work, 2, stagnating real wages, and 3, lagging levels of remote hybrid alternative modes of work post-COVID compared to other countries. So where can we find the glimmers of hope, do you think?"
Okay, I think, hello, Helen. Sorry, I can't see you in person. Yes, of course, gender equality is people always point to Japan as being country 126 or so on the gender equality index, and that it's slipped down and so on. And it's a serious issue in many ways, and not just a humanistic way, but also an economic way, because expanding the workforce and addressing low birth rates and so on, it seems quite clear that the values of younger people do not support the gender division of labor that existed in the post-war period. So it's the institutions and the regulations are kind of out of sync with the reality that younger people face. And an increasing proportion of younger people expect not to marry, not to have children, or to have fewer children, which has the potential to accelerate demographic, shrinkage of Japan. So there are lots of issues there, and the fundamental breadwinner model of the post-war period, the institutions of it, for instance, the 1.3 million yen Social Security payment ceiling and those other institutions which support a breadwinner model haven't really been tackled yet. And there were attempts early on in the 2000s which failed. I suspect the momentum is sufficient that significant changes will happen in the 2020s in terms of institutions, but whether the work-life balance and the long working hours associated with Japanese employment will change that quickly is doubtful. So that is a gradual change. But I think Japan will change, and I think in Japan's past history, okay, there was a gendered division of labor, but women also worked naturally. And I think Japan can create a new model, which is a post-male breadwinner model, but it requires addressing work-life balance. And the government is trying to do it currently through what it's calling the New Trinity labor reforms. And the New Trinity labor reforms is a recognition that institutional change has to be tackled on several different fronts at the same time. The Trinity is to promote reskilling, because there's been a serious underinvestment in human resources in Japan. So reskilling, and the second one is what it calls a shift to job-based employment, away from membership employment. And there are lots of ambiguities about that, but the idea is that if people upskill, then if they can be employed with those skills, they won't face the disadvantage of not having spent their entire career in those companies. So upskilling, job-based employment, and particularly job-based wages. And the third one is, what's the third one? Mobility, labor market mobility. So the thinking is there are a lot of people in Japan who are trapped in jobs which don't suit them. And if they were upskilled and if the institutional disincentives were taken away for them to move, like membership employment, which rewards years of service, then people would find their way into more productive sectors of the economy, particularly IT. So it announced this is the new form of capitalism council, announced these New Trinity reforms. And it's an interesting set of propositions, but also full of tensions and contradictions.
Right.
So there is no simple answer to your question, Helen, although the New Trinity labor reforms are an interesting attempt. The head of Bengal, who was on that panel, then criticized the New Trinity reforms, saying, well, why would employers invest in training people if they're going to leave.
Mm.
So that's one of the several contradictions in that. But there is an awareness that something needs to change fundamentally from the post-war breadwinner model and so-called Japanese style employment of the post-war model.
Thank you. One last question from the room. Yes.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I really learned so much from this talk. Really, it's been great. I was very interested with your last slide was talking about, you mentioned the communitarian side of Japan. And it strikes me that the Japanese are, in a sense, more human. The human side of things is more important than it is in countries like the UK and America. So, for example, in the UK, banks, I mean, there's hardly any banks left, physical banks. But I think it seems to me that in Japan, the banks are just all still there, they haven't been closed down. Cash is still widely used. So it seems a little, it could be said to be a laggard digitally. But at the same time, it could be said to be more, make it into just keep it as a nice place to live where older people are comfortable, you know, because older people are really bewildered by having to deal with, you know, banking online and things like that. So I feel that also, I think a lot of people feel, you know, Japan is an extremely high functioning country. I mean, you know, people say, you know, if this is recession when, you know, the Japanese economy has been doing badly, you know, I wish we could have some of it in Rotherham. The thing is that, you know, the economy hasn't really grown very much in the last 20 years, but the standard of living seems very good. You know, you've got good healthcare, you've got good public transport, very high employment, you know, very little unemployment. There doesn't seem any sort of great sense of crisis. And I think for me, that this is the thing. So it's not exactly pessimism about Japan, because I think Japan might keep some of the things that are good about itself, but it makes it difficult, I think, for Japan to really change and become, you know, more competitive economy.
Well, I think this is the kind of dilemma. Japan, through investors, is always being lambasted as being a laggard, especially in digital. And, you know, where are Japan's Silicon Valley GAFAs and et cetera, and banks, they look at them, they're dinosaurs and so on and so on. Well, interestingly, in the 2000s and up until the late 2010s, the number of bank branches in Japan, despite banks saying that they're going to cut back, actually increased marginally because of the view that face-to-face customer interaction was important. And, you know, a lot of the customers are now getting old and they like that interaction. And it's part of, you know, getting out of the house and going to the bank and then going to the doctor's surgery and so on. So whereas it's young people who do the pay and kind of go to digital banks and so on. So the mega banks have tended to keep their branches, although they say they're going to cut them. I'll bet you in rural areas, they will end up with consortia of banks, you know, consolidating their branches so that they don't lose all those facilities in the countryside. And this relates to the idea that Japan and digital Society 5.0 and the digital economy should be different from the US and should be different from China. And Japan, this is the post-neoliberal kind of thinking. I detected in some areas, for instance, in Aizu Wakamatsu, and coming out of the Tohoku disaster, kind of new networks, and some of them were young people who were involved in reconstruction, becoming involved in digital networks like, what's it? Some kind of network that they have brigades and they have hackathons and all this. And you'll find in there a kind of an ethos of the digital transformation in Japan should be more equitable and should be compatible with democracy. And this is behind these local coins and, the digital wallets that you get in cities like Aizu, Wakamatsu, and other places where you get points when you shop and you can redeem those points. And so it's kind of keeping money circulating in the local economy and, importantly, keeping information about people's habits in the local economy rather than being sucked up by some, giant IT firm. So there is an undercurrent of particularly young people and these networks trying to figure out how can we make a more decentralized and democratically accountable form of digital economy and digital capitalism. So I've kind of meandered a bit from you. Put in an observation that intrigues me from the Aizu Wakamatsu. Accenture set up an Aizu Wakamatsu because it was a city that was deindustrializing and depopulating, and it was on the fringes of Tohoku, and so they wanted to contribute to reconstruction, but these kind of networks have formed around there, which I think are worth watching, and people haven't picked up on them, I think. Case for Japan? Is that what it's called? Case for Japan? There is a case for America or something. And then lots of local cities have their, not case, it's, it'll come to me after the seminar, I'm sure.
Well, thank you very much. We've reached the end of the time, but we will continue the conversation in the senior common room. So please join us there. There's a few bottles of wine and some orange juice I hear. I have a Bordeaux on the red side and a Pic Boule de Binet on the white. That always helps to, motivate people to come. As we are under a quite tight security regime, if you don't have a SOAS badge, please attach yourself to somebody who does, and we will take you through security into the senior common room. Thank you very much, Hugh, for this wonderful talk. Thank you for coming tonight, and I hope I will see you next week when we have Kubota Akiko, who will play the biwa, accompanied by the British composer Francesca Lelohe, who will speak about their new song cycle about the life of feminist and anarchist Ito Noe. So please subscribe to the JRC list, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.